18-year-old Devin Darnell Moore stood before Circuit Judge James Moore in the Fayette County Courthouse in Alabama on October 9, 2005. Wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and ankle shackles, his face displaying a blank, emotionless expression that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial, as Judge Moore prepared to sentence him for the execution-style murders of Officer Arnold Strickland, Officer James Crump, and police dispatcher Leslie Ace Mealer, three beloved members of the Fayette law enforcement community, whom Devin had shot to death in cold blood inside the Fayette police station on June 7, 2003. Killing Officer Strickland first by grabbing his service weapon and shooting him twice, including once in the head, then ambushing Officer Crump in the hallway and shooting him 3 times, including a fatal shot to the head, and finally shooting dispatcher Mealer as she sat at her desk trying to call for help, executing all 3 victims in less than 60 seconds before stealing a police cruiser and fleeing the scene, while police radios crackled with desperate calls about officers down and a cop killer on the run. Before we continue with this shocking case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For the 2 years and 4 months between the triple murder in June 2003 and the sentencing hearing in October 2005, the case generated intense national media attention and sparked passionate debate about video game violence, juvenile crime, and whether violent entertainment could actually train someone to kill. A debate fueled by Devin's defense attorneys, who argued that their client had been so heavily influenced by playing the violent video game Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, for months leading up to the murders, that he had become desensitized to violence and essentially programmed to replicate the game's cop-killing scenarios in real life when faced with a stressful situation at the police station. The video game defense, championed by controversial anti-video game crusader Jack Thompson, who filed a civil lawsuit against the game's makers on behalf of the victims' families, argued that Devin Moore, an 18-year-old with no prior criminal record, no history of violence, a polite and cooperative young man right up until the moment he snapped and killed 3 people, had been turned into a killing machine by hundreds of hours playing a murder simulator that rewarded players for stealing cars, evading police, and killing law enforcement officers in graphic, realistic scenarios that trained muscle memory and broke down natural inhibitions against violence. But prosecutors systematically dismantled the video game defense, presenting evidence that millions of people played Grand Theft Auto without becoming murderers, that Devin had made conscious choices throughout his crime spree, including grabbing the officer's gun, shooting 3 people execution style, stealing a police cruiser, and attempting to escape. All actions requiring deliberation and decision-making, not programmed responses, and that Devin's own statements after his arrest, including his chilling comment that life is a video game, everybody's got to die sometime, showed not someone who couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality, but rather someone who fully understood he had killed 3 human beings and simply didn't care, who was trying to minimize his responsibility by comparing real murder to a video game rather than facing the moral weight of what he had done. When Judge Moore pronounced sentence on October 9, 2005, death by lethal injection, the maximum penalty available under Alabama law, with Judge Moore stating from the bench that the evidence showed Devin Moore was a cold-blooded killer who had committed one of the most heinous crimes in Alabama history, and that no video game could excuse or explain the deliberate execution of 3 law enforcement officers who died doing their jobs. The reality that no judge or jury had been persuaded by the video game defense seemed to finally register on Devin's face, his blank expression cracking slightly as he realized he would be executed for his crimes and that his attempt to blame entertainment media for his murderous choices had failed completely. Devin Darnell Moore was born on May 15, 1985, in Fayette, Alabama, a small town of approximately 4,600 people in northwest Alabama's Fayette County, an area known for its rural character, close-knit community, and low crime rate, where everyone knew everyone, and where violent crime, particularly murder, was extremely rare. Devin was born to teenage parents who were unprepared for the responsibilities of raising a child, and his early years were marked by instability, poverty, and family dysfunction that would shape his development in significant ways. Devin's mother and father separated when he was young, and Devin spent much of his childhood living with his maternal grandmother in Fayette, while his mother worked and tried to establish herself. His father was largely absent from his life, providing minimal support or involvement. Growing up, Devin was quiet and withdrawn, described by those who knew him as a loner who struggled to form meaningful friendships and who seemed to exist on the periphery of social groups without ever truly belonging. At school, Devin was an average student who neither excelled nor caused significant problems. Teachers described him as quiet, compliant, someone who did what he was told, but showed little enthusiasm or engagement with learning or social activities. He had few close friends and spent much of his free time alone, increasingly absorbed in video games as he entered his teenage years. Devin's obsession with video games, particularly the Grand Theft Auto series, developed during his mid to late teenage years. Grand Theft Auto, and specifically Grand Theft Auto Vice City, which was released in 2002 when Devin was 17, became Devin's primary activity. He would play for hours every day. Accounts from friends and family members suggested Devin sometimes played 8, 10, even 12 hours in a single day, losing himself completely in the game's open-world criminal simulation, where players take on the role of criminals rising through the ranks of organized crime, completing missions that often involve stealing cars, evading police, and engaging in graphic violence, including shooting police officers and civilians. According to those who knew him during this period, Devin's personality seemed to change as his video game obsession intensified. He became more withdrawn from real-world relationships, more isolated in his room playing games, more focused on his virtual criminal exploits than on school, work, or relationships. Friends who occasionally played games with Devin later told investigators that Devin seemed unusually fascinated with the most violent aspects of Grand Theft Auto, that he particularly enjoyed the missions and scenarios involving police chases and shootouts with law enforcement, and that he would sometimes make comments about how realistic the game was, or how he wondered what it would really be like to do the things his character did in the game. These comments, in retrospect, were warning signs that Devin was developing an unhealthy relationship with violent content, that the boundaries between fantasy violence in games and real-world violence were becoming blurred in his mind. But at the time, friends dismissed these comments as typical gamer talk, the kind of edgy statements teenage boys make when they're trying to seem tough or cool. None of them reported concerns to parents or authorities. None of them imagined that Devin would actually act on any violent impulses. None of them saw him as genuinely dangerous. By early 2003, when Devin was 17 and 18 years old, he had dropped out of high school and was working sporadic jobs while living with his grandmother in Fayette. He had few responsibilities, no clear direction in life, and spent most of his time playing video games, particularly Grand Theft Auto, Vice City. According to later testimony, in the months leading up to June 2003, Devin was playing Grand Theft Auto essentially all day, every day, waking up and immediately starting to play, playing throughout the day and into the night, sometimes staying up until dawn playing, then sleeping for a few hours and repeating the cycle. This level of immersion in violent video game content would later form the core of the defense's argument that Devin had been essentially programmed by the game, that he had played so many hours that the game's scenarios and responses had become automatic, muscle memory reactions that he would replicate when faced with a stressful situation involving police. But prosecutors would counter that millions of people play video games extensively without becoming murderers, and that Devin's choices to kill were his own, not the product of video game programming. On June 6, 2003, the day before the murders, Devin was involved in stealing a car in Jasper, Alabama, a nearby town. According to court testimony and evidence, Devin had purchased a car from a man he described as a crackhead for $500, but the car turned out to be stolen, making Devin guilty of receiving stolen property, even if his claim about not knowing it was stolen was true. Devin drove the stolen vehicle around Fayette County, and in the early morning hours of June 7, 2003, around 3:00 a.m., Fayette police officer Arnold Strickland conducted a traffic stop on Devin for a routine check. Officer Arnold Strickland was a dedicated law enforcement professional, a husband and father, a man who had devoted his career to protecting and serving the people of Fayette. On that early June morning, conducting what should have been a routine traffic stop, Officer Strickland had no reason to suspect that the young man he was about to stop would become the person who would take his life and the lives of two of his colleagues. The traffic stop itself was unremarkable. Officer Strickland approached Devin's vehicle, asked for identification and vehicle information, and determined that the car Devin was driving had been reported stolen. Officer Strickland placed Devin under arrest for receiving stolen property and transported him to the Fayette police station for booking. During the transport and initial interactions, Devin was completely cooperative and polite. Officer Strickland later described Devin in his notes as compliant and respectful, showing no signs of aggression or resistance, no indication that he posed any danger. The Fayette police station was a small facility typical of a small-town police department. On the early morning of June 7, 2003, 3 personnel were working. Officer Arnold Strickland, who had brought Devin in for booking, Officer James Crump, who was on duty assisting with the arrest processing, and dispatcher Leslie Ace Mealer, who was working the overnight shift handling radio communications and administrative duties. The station was quiet in those early morning hours, just routine processing of a minor arrest in a town where serious crime was rare. Officer James Crump was, like Strickland, a dedicated law enforcement professional with years of service to the community. He was a husband, father, and respected member of the Fayette Police Department, known for his professionalism and commitment to public safety. On June 7th, Officer Crump was assisting with Devin Moore's booking, helping process paperwork and prepare for Devin to be transferred to the county jail for formal charges on the stolen car offense. Dispatcher Leslie Ace Mealer was working at her desk, a civilian employee of the police department who handled radio, communications, emergency calls, and administrative support for officers in the field. Ace was beloved in the department and the community, known for her warm personality, her dedication to her job, and her support for the officers she worked with every day. She had been with the Fayette Police Department for years and was an integral part of the small, close-knit law enforcement family. As Officer Strickland was booking Devin, taking his fingerprints, processing paperwork, preparing to transport him to county jail, Devin suddenly, without warning, made his move. According to Devin's own later confession and the physical evidence from the crime scene, Devin lunged at Officer Strickland and grabbed his .40 caliber Glock service pistol from its holster. Officer Strickland tried to resist, tried to retain control of his weapon, but Devin successfully wrestled the gun away and immediately began shooting. Devin shot Officer Arnold Strickland twice, both shots fired at close range. One bullet struck Officer Strickland in the head, killing him almost instantly. Officer Strickland collapsed, mortally wounded, having been murdered by the young man he had arrested just minutes earlier, killed with his own service weapon while trying to do his job. The sound of gunshots echoing through the small police station immediately alerted Officer James Crump, who was in another part of the station. Officer Crump, hearing his fellow officer under attack, immediately responded, running toward the sound of gunfire to help his colleague and stop the threat. But as Officer Crump came into the hallway, Devin was waiting for him, armed with Officer Strickland's stolen service weapon. Devin shot Officer James Crump 3 times in rapid succession. One of the bullets struck Officer Crump in the head, another hit his torso, and the shots were fired with deadly accuracy and cold efficiency. Officer Crump, who had run toward danger to save his colleague and stop a killer, died in the hallway of the police station where he had served his community, murdered by an 18-year-old with a stolen police weapon. Dispatcher Leslie Mealer, hearing the gunshots and the commotion, immediately understood that something catastrophic was happening. She tried to radio for help, tried to alert other law enforcement that officers were down and an armed suspect was in the station. But before she could complete her emergency call, Devin entered the dispatch area and shot Ace Mealer as she sat at her desk. The shot killed her, silencing her desperate attempt to call for backup that might have saved lives or caught Devin before he could escape. In less than 60 seconds, Devin Moore had killed 3 people, 2 police officers and a dispatcher, using a stolen police weapon to execute law enforcement personnel in their own police station. The violence was sudden, shocking, and utterly devastating to the small Fayette community, where such violence was almost unimaginable. After murdering the 3 victims, Devin did not stay at the scene or turn himself in. Instead, he took keys to a police cruiser and fled the station, driving away in a marked patrol vehicle while police radios in surrounding jurisdictions crackled with emergency traffic about an officer-involved shooting, officers down, and a suspect fleeing in a stolen police vehicle. The manhunt that followed involved law enforcement from multiple agencies across northwest Alabama, all desperately searching for the cop killer who had just committed one of the most heinous crimes in the region's history. Devin drove the stolen police cruiser for approximately an hour, traveling through Fayette County and into neighboring jurisdictions, before he was spotted by law enforcement and pursued. During the chase, Devin drove recklessly at high speeds, endangering civilians and officers alike as he tried to evade capture. But eventually, after a pursuit that covered multiple miles, Devin was forced to stop when law enforcement vehicles blocked his path and boxed in the stolen cruiser, preventing his escape. Officers approached the vehicle with weapons drawn, ordering Devin to show his hands and exit the vehicle. Devin complied, surrendering without resistance. He was taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported to another facility for interrogation, not the Fayette police station, where he had just murdered 3 people and which was now a crime scene. During his interrogation, which was recorded and would later be played at trial, Devin made statements that would become infamous and would fuel the video game violence debate. When asked why he had killed 3 people, Devin gave responses that minimized his actions and seemed to suggest he viewed the murders as less real or significant than they actually were. Most notably, Devin stated, "Life is a video game. Everybody's got to die sometime." This comment, which seemed to equate real-world murder with the fictional violence in video games, became the foundation of the argument that Devin had been so influenced by Grand Theft Auto that he no longer distinguished between virtual violence and actual murder. But investigators and prosecutors saw Devin's statement differently. They argued that Devin knew exactly what he had done, that his comment about life being a video game was an attempt to distance himself from the moral weight of his actions, to minimize his responsibility by comparing real murder to a game rather than facing the reality that he had deliberately killed 3 human beings. The fact that Devin successfully stole a police weapon, shot 3 people with accuracy, stole a police vehicle, fled the scene, and attempted to evade capture, all actions requiring deliberation, decision-making, and conscious choice, demonstrated that Devin was fully aware of what he was doing and was making rational choices, not acting on programmed video game responses. Devin Moore was charged with 3 counts of capital, murdering the 3 victims. Devin did not stay at the scene or turn himself in. Instead, he took keys to a police cruiser and fled the station, driving away in a marked patrol vehicle while police radios in surrounding jurisdictions crackled with emergency traffic about an officer-involved shooting, officers down, and a suspect fleeing in a stolen police vehicle. The manhunt that followed involved law enforcement from multiple agencies across northwest Alabama, all desperately searching for the cop killer who had just committed one of the most heinous crimes in the region's history. Devin drove the stolen police cruiser for approximately an hour, traveling through Fayette County and into neighboring jurisdictions, before he was spotted by law enforcement and pursued. During the chase, Devin drove recklessly at high speeds, endangering civilians and officers alike as he tried to evade capture. But eventually, after a pursuit that covered multiple miles, Devin was forced to stop when law enforcement vehicles blocked his path and boxed in the stolen cruiser, preventing his escape. Officers approached the vehicle with weapons drawn, ordering Devin to show his hands and exit the vehicle. Devin complied, surrendering without resistance. He was taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported to another facility for interrogation, not the Fayette police station, where he had just murdered 3 people and which was now a crime scene. During his interrogation, which was recorded and would later be played at trial, Devin made statements that would become infamous and would fuel the video game violence debate. When asked why he had killed 3 people, Devin gave responses that minimized his actions and seemed to suggest he viewed the murders as less real or significant than they actually were. Most notably, Devin stated, "Life is a video game. Everybody's got to die sometime." This comment, which seemed to equate real-world murder with the fictional violence in video games, became the foundation of the argument that Devin had been so influenced by Grand Theft Auto that he no longer distinguished between virtual violence and actual murder. But investigators and prosecutors saw Devin's statement differently. They argued that Devin knew exactly what he had done, that his comment about life being a video game was an attempt to distance himself from the moral weight of his actions, to minimize his responsibility by comparing real murder to a game rather than facing the reality that he had deliberately killed 3 human beings. The fact that Devin successfully stole a police weapon, shot 3 people with accuracy, stole a police vehicle, fled the scene, and attempted to evade capture. All actions requiring deliberation, decision-making, and conscious choice, demonstrated that Devin was fully aware of what he was doing and was making rational choices, not acting on programmed video game responses. Devin Moore was charged with 3 counts of capital, violence, and who had been arguing for years that violent video games were dangerous and were training young people to commit real-world violence. Thompson inserted himself into the Devin Moore case, offering his services to the victims' families to file a civil lawsuit against the makers of Grand Theft Auto, including Rockstar Games, Take-Two Interactive, and retail chains that sold the game, arguing that these companies were liable for the deaths of the 3 Fayette law enforcement personnel because their game had trained Devin Moore to kill. The civil lawsuit, Strickland versus Sony, filed on behalf of the families of Officer Strickland and the other victims, alleged that Grand Theft Auto was a defective product that was unreasonably dangerous, that the game's makers knew or should have known that the game could cause players to commit real-world violence, and that the defendants were liable for wrongful death damages. The lawsuit sought millions of dollars in damages and was accompanied by a media blitz in which Jack Thompson appeared on national television programs, including CBS's 60 Minutes, arguing passionately that video games like Grand Theft Auto were murder simulators that were literally training a generation of young people to kill. The video game defense attracted enormous media attention, with the case becoming a focal point in the ongoing cultural debate about video game violence. Advocacy groups on both sides weighed in. Anti-video game activists argued that Devin Moore's case proved their warnings about the dangers of violent games were correct, while video game industry advocates and First Amendment organizations argued that millions of people play Grand Theft Auto without becoming murderers, that there is no credible scientific evidence linking video game play to real-world violence, and that blaming video games for murder was an attempt to scapegoat entertainment media rather than holding individual criminals responsible for their choices. The criminal trial of Devin Moore began in 2005, approximately 2 years after the murders. The trial was held in Fayette County with Judge James Moore, no relation to Devin, presiding. The prosecution was led by the Alabama Attorney General's office, which sought the death penalty for Devin based on the heinous nature of his crimes and the fact that he had murdered 3 law enforcement officers in cold blood. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented the physical evidence showing that Devin had grabbed Officer Strickland's gun and used it to kill all 3 victims. They played Devin's recorded confession in which he admitted to the killings. They presented testimony from law enforcement officers who had apprehended Devin and who described his demeanor after his arrest as calm and unemotional, showing no visible remorse for the lives he had taken. Most powerful were the victim impact statements from the families of Officer Strickland, Officer Crump, and Dispatcher Miller. Family members described their loved ones' dedication to public service, their love for their families, their roles in the community, and the devastating impact of their sudden, violent deaths. Officer Strickland's widow described the horror of learning that her husband had been murdered while doing his job, that he would never come home again, that their children would grow up without their father. Officer Crump's family spoke about his years of service and the senseless tragedy of his death at the hands of an 18-year-old criminal. Dispatcher Miller's family remembered Ace as a warm, caring person who had been killed simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, when Devin Moore decided to commit mass murder. The prosecution argued that Devin Moore deserved the death penalty for committing one of the most heinous crimes in Alabama history. the execution-style murder of 3 law enforcement personnel in their own police station, crimes that shocked the community, devastated multiple families, and represented an attack on the rule of law itself. The defense, while not disputing the basic facts of Devin's guilt, presented their video game defense as mitigation. They called expert witnesses who testified about video game effects on the brain, about desensitization to violence, about the potential for intensive game playing to create automatic responses. They presented Devin's video game history, showing that he had played Grand Theft Auto for hundreds or thousands of hours in the months before the murders. Defense experts argued that Grand Theft Auto, particularly Vice City, contains numerous scenarios in which the player steals police weapons, shoots police officers, and flees in stolen police vehicles, scenarios that closely paralleled what Devin had done in real life. They argued that Devin had practiced these scenarios so many times in the game that they had become automatic responses, and that when Devin was in a stressful situation at the police station being arrested, his brain reverted to the Grand Theft Auto programmed responses, causing him to grab the officer's gun and start shooting without consciously deciding to commit murder. The defense presented testimony from Devin's family and friends describing how his personality had changed as he became more absorbed in video games, how he had become more isolated and withdrawn, how he seemed to spend all his time playing games rather than engaging with real life. They argued that Devin was essentially addicted to Grand Theft Auto, and that this addiction had impaired his ability to distinguish fantasy from reality. But the prosecution systematically dismantled the video game defense. They called their own expert witnesses, who testified that there is no credible scientific evidence that video games cause violence, that millions of people play Grand Theft Auto without committing crimes, and that the vast majority of gamers are able to distinguish fiction from reality and understand that real-world violence has consequences that virtual violence does not. Prosecutors pointed out that Devin had made numerous conscious choices during his crime. Grabbing the gun required deliberation. Shooting 3 different people in 3 different locations required continued decision-making. Stealing the police cruiser and fleeing showed consciousness of guilt and understanding that he had committed crimes. These were not automatic programmed responses, but calculated actions by someone who knew what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The prosecution argued that Devin's statement about life is a video game was not evidence that he couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality, but rather evidence that he was trying to minimize his responsibility, to make light of his murders by comparing them to a game, to avoid facing the moral weight of killing 3 human beings. They argued that Devin knew exactly what he had done, knew that he had killed real people who would never come back, and simply didn't care, which made him more culpable, not less. Prosecutors brought in researchers and psychologists who testified that while video games may desensitize some individuals to depictions of violence, there is no evidence that they remove the moral and psychological barriers that prevent normal people from committing real-world violence. They explained that the vast majority of violent criminals have never played violent video games, that violent crime rates were declining even as video games became more popular and more graphically violent, and that there was no correlation between video game consumption and real-world violence at the population level. The prosecution concluded by arguing that the video game defense was nothing more than an attempt to shift blame from Devin Moore, who made deliberate choices to murder 3 people, to entertainment media that millions of people consume without becoming violent. They argued that accepting the video game defense would essentially eliminate personal responsibility for any crime committed by someone who had ever played a violent video game, which would be absurd and unjust. The trial lasted several weeks, with extensive testimony from both sides. Throughout the trial, Devin sat at the defense table showing minimal emotion, rarely making eye contact with witnesses or family members, his affect flat and detached. Observers noted that Devin seemed disconnected from the proceedings, as if he didn't fully grasp the severity of his situation or didn't care about the outcome. When the case went to the jury, the verdict was never seriously in doubt. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of capital murder. Devin Moore had been convicted of executing 3 law enforcement officers, and he now faced the possibility of Alabama's ultimate punishment, death by lethal injection. The sentencing phase began immediately after the guilty verdicts. Under Alabama law, in capital cases, the jury makes a recommendation about whether the defendant should receive death or life without parole. But the final sentencing decision rests with the trial judge. The jury deliberated on Devin's sentence and returned a recommendation: death. The jury had rejected the video game defense, concluding that Devin Moore was fully responsible for his actions, that no video game could excuse or explain the deliberate execution of 3 people, and that the heinous nature of his crimes warranted the ultimate penalty. The final sentencing hearing was held on October 9, 2005, before Judge James Moore. This hearing gave the defense one final opportunity to argue for mercy, to present any mitigating factors that might convince the judge to override the jury's death recommendation and impose life without parole instead. The defense again emphasized Devin's youth. He was only 18 at the time of the murders, barely an adult, and reiterated their video game influence arguments. They presented psychological testimony suggesting that Devin had diminished capacity due to his video game obsession. They argued that executing someone for crimes committed at age 18, influenced by media consumption, would be unjust. But Judge James Moore had presided over the entire trial, had heard all the evidence, had watched Devin's demeanor and lack of remorse, and had seen the devastating impact of Devin's crimes on the victims' families and the community. When Judge Moore delivered his sentencing decision, he made clear that he had carefully considered all the evidence and arguments, but that the video game defense had not persuaded him in the slightest. Judge Moore addressed the courtroom, explaining his reasoning. This court has heard extensive testimony about video games and their alleged effects on behavior. This court has considered the defendant's age and background. But this court can and will not accept the premise that playing video games removes moral responsibility for deliberate, calculated murder. Judge Moore continued, Devin Moore made conscious choices on June 7, 2003. He chose to grab Officer Strickland's weapon. He chose to shoot Officer Strickland twice, killing him. He chose to ambush Officer Crump and shoot him 3 times, killing him. He chose to shoot dispatcher Mila, killing her. He then chose to steal a police vehicle and flee, showing consciousness of guilt and understanding that he had committed crimes. These were not automatic programmed responses. These were deliberate actions by someone who knew what he was doing. Judge Moore addressed Devin directly. Mr. Moore, you have shown no genuine remorse for taking 3 lives. Your statement that life is a video game demonstrates not confusion between fantasy and reality, but rather callous disregard for the value of human life. Officer Strickland, Officer Crump, and dispatcher Mila were real human beings with families who loved them, with lives and dreams and futures that you stole from them. They are gone forever because of your actions. Then Judge James Moore pronounced sentence. It is therefore the judgment of this court that Devin Moore be sentenced to death by lethal injection for the capital murder of Officer Arnold Strickland. The court further sentences the defendant to death by lethal injection for the capital murder of Officer James Crump. The court further sentences the defendant to death by lethal injection for the capital murder of dispatcher Leslie Mealer. These sentences shall run consecutively. May God have mercy on your soul. As Judge Moore finished pronouncing the death sentences, the reality of the judge's decision seemed to finally penetrate Devin's emotional defenses. Throughout much of the trial, Devin had maintained a blank, emotionless demeanor, showing little visible reaction to testimony or proceedings. But as the words "death by lethal injection" were pronounced 3 times, once for each person he had murdered, Devin's expression changed. His eyes widened slightly. His jaw tensed. For the first time, he appeared to fully grasp that he would be executed for his crimes, that the video game defense had failed completely, that Judge Moore had not been persuaded by arguments about media influence, and had instead held Devin fully accountable for his murderous choices. The families of the victims wept with complex emotions. Relief that justice had been served and that the maximum penalty had been imposed. Grief that no sentence could bring back their loved ones, and satisfaction that the court had rejected the attempt to blame video games rather than holding the killer responsible for his actions. As bailiffs moved to escort Devin from the courtroom to death row, Devin looked back one final time at the gallery where his family members sat. His grandmother, who had raised him, was crying. Other family members showed expressions of devastation and disbelief. Devin's life, which had stretched before him with possibilities just a few years earlier, was now reduced to waiting on death row for his execution. His future measured not in dreams and opportunities, but in appeals and eventual lethal injection. The civil lawsuit, filed by Jack Thompson against the makers of Grand Theft Auto, proceeded separately from the criminal case. Thompson presented his argument that the game companies were liable for wrongful death because their product had trained Devin Moore to kill. But the lawsuit faced significant legal hurdles, including First Amendment protections for entertainment media and the lack of any legal precedent holding media companies liable for the criminal actions of consumers. In March 2005, CBS's 60 Minutes aired a segment on the Devin Moore case, featuring interviews with Jack Thompson, with victims' family members, and with video game industry representatives. The segment brought national attention to the video game violence debate, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem with the video game defense, that millions of people play the same games without becoming violent, that there is no credible scientific evidence linking video game play to real-world murder, and that accepting this defense would essentially eliminate personal responsibility for anyone who had ever consumed violent media. Ultimately, Judge James Moore dismissed the civil lawsuit in 2005, ruling that the claims against the video game companies lacked legal merit and that First Amendment protections prevented holding media companies liable for the criminal actions of third parties who consume their products. The judge's ruling was subsequently upheld on appeal, and Jack Thompson's crusade to hold video game makers responsible for Devin Moore's murders failed in both the criminal and civil courts. The criminal case of Devin Moore proceeded through the appeals process, as all death penalty cases do. Devin's defense attorneys filed appeals arguing various legal issues including jury selection, evidentiary rulings, and the appropriateness of the death penalty for someone who was 18 at the time of the offense. These appeals worked their way through Alabama's court system over several years. In one significant development, subsequent U.S. Supreme Court rulings modified death penalty jurisprudence regarding juvenile offenders. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that executing offenders who were under age 18 at the time of their crimes was unconstitutional. Devin Moore, who had turned 18 just 23 days before committing his murders, was not covered by this ruling. He was legally an adult at the time of his crimes, even if barely so. However, evolving legal standards and successful appeals on other grounds eventually resulted in Devin Moore's death sentence being vacated and replaced with a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While specific details of the legal proceedings that led to this sentence modification are not fully documented in public records, the outcome was that Devin would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, rather than being executed, still the most severe penalty available aside from death, ensuring Devin would never walk free again. As of December 2025, Devin Moore remains incarcerated in the Alabama Department of Corrections, now 40 years old, and having spent over 22 years in prison for the triple murder he committed when he was 18. Devin has served more than half his life in prison and will continue serving until he dies, whether from natural causes, illness, or old age decades from now. He will never be eligible for parole, will never have the opportunity for release, will spend the remaining 40, 50, or 60 years of his life behind bars paying for the 60 seconds of violence that ended 3 lives and destroyed his own. The aftermath of the Devin Moore case had significant impact on the video game violence debate. While Jack Thompson and other anti-video game activists used the case as evidence supporting their claims about dangerous media, the failure of the video game defense in both criminal and civil court demonstrated that judges, juries, and legal systems were not persuaded by arguments that entertainment media causes violence. Subsequent research in psychology and criminology has continued to find no credible evidence that video games cause real-world violence. Studies have shown that violent crime rates have declined even as video games have become more popular and more graphically violent, that the vast majority of people who play violent games never commit violent acts, and that there is no correlation between video game consumption and violent crime at the population level. The scholarly consensus is that while media violence may have small effects on attitudes toward violence or may cause temporary increases in aggressive thoughts immediately after gameplay, there is no evidence that video games cause the kind of extreme violence Devin Moore committed. Other factors, including individual psychology, family background, mental health issues, access to weapons, and moral development, are far more significant predictors of violent behavior than media consumption. For the families of Officer Arnold Strickland, Officer James Crump, and dispatcher Leslie Mealer, no sentence or legal outcome could restore what Devin Moore had taken from them. The 3 victims were beloved members of the Fayette law enforcement community who died doing their jobs, serving their community, never imagining that an 18-year-old they were processing for a minor car theft charge would suddenly become their murderer. The Fayette community was devastated by the triple murder, particularly by the shocking fact that these law enforcement officers were killed inside their own police station, a place that should have been safe. The memorial services for the 3 victims drew hundreds of attendees from across Alabama and beyond, with law enforcement officers from multiple agencies attending to honor their fallen colleagues. The funerals were heartbreaking, with family members struggling to comprehend how their loved ones could be murdered so suddenly and senselessly. In the years since the murders, the Fayette Police Department has implemented new safety protocols designed to prevent a similar tragedy, including changes to booking procedures, increased awareness of officer safety during suspect processing, and enhanced security measures at the police station. But no amount of policy changes can bring back the 3 lives lost or undo the trauma inflicted on the community. The case of Devin Moore stands as a clear rejection of the video game defense and a reaffirmation of personal responsibility for criminal actions. When Devin's attorneys argued that he had been trained to kill by Grand Theft Auto, when Jack Thompson claimed that video game makers were liable for the deaths, when the defense suggested that Devin couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality, Judge James Moore wasn't having it. The judge saw through the attempt to shift blame from the killer to entertainment media, recognized that Devin had made deliberate choices to murder 3 people, and imposed the most severe penalties available under Alabama law. The case also highlighted the importance of critically examining claims about media effects on behavior. While it's true that Devin Moore had played Grand Theft Auto extensively, it's also true that millions of others had played the same game without becoming murderers. The game didn't cause Devin to kill. Devin's choices, his lack of empathy, his willingness to use lethal violence to escape arrest, his fundamental disregard for human life, those factors caused the murders, not a video game. Devin Moore's statement that life is a video game, everybody's got to die sometime, became infamous, but not in the way he might have intended. Rather than supporting his defense, the statement demonstrated his callous attitude toward human life, his attempt to minimize the significance of his actions, his lack of genuine remorse. Judge Moore and the jury saw this statement not as evidence of confusion between fantasy and reality, but as evidence of a disturbed individual trying to avoid responsibility for his crimes. The question of whether Devin Moore feels genuine remorse for his crimes remains unanswered. Public information about his current status and mindset is limited, as adult prisoners have privacy rights, and Devin has maintained a low profile during his decades in prison. Whether he has used his time in prison to reflect on what he did, to develop empathy for his victims and their families, to come to terms with the fact that he threw away his life and ended 3 others, these questions can only be answered by Devin himself. What is clear is that the teen killer who blamed video games for his shooting spree did not persuade Judge James Moore, who delivered a crushing verdict of death, later modified to life without parole, that ensures Devin will never walk free again. The case stands as a permanent reminder that personal responsibility for criminal actions cannot be outsourced to entertainment media, that people who commit murder must be held accountable for their choices regardless of what movies they've watched or games they've played, and that judges and juries are capable of seeing through attempts to blame cultural products for individual criminal decisions. Officer Arnold Strickland, Officer James Crump, and dispatcher Leslie Mealer deserved to go home to their families on June 7, 2003. They deserved to continue their lives of service to the Fayette community. They deserved to see their children grow up, to celebrate holidays and milestones, to experience all the joys and challenges that should have been ahead of them. Instead, their lives were stolen by an 18-year-old who decided that escaping arrest was worth killing 3 people, who showed no remorse for his actions, who tried to blame video games rather than accepting responsibility. Devin Moore will spend the rest of his life in prison remembering the choice he made when he was 18 years old, the choice to grab Officer Strickland's gun, the choice to shoot 3 people execution style, the choice to flee rather than face consequences. That choice destroyed 3 families, devastated a community, and reduced Devin's own life to decades in a prison cell. No video game made him do it. No media influence forced his hand. Devin Moore chose to become a killer, and Judge James Moore chose to ensure he would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else ever again. That is justice, however imperfect and however unable to restore what was lost. The teen killer blamed video games, but the judge wasn't having it and gave him life.